So this is kind of a controversial video, but this is something that I think is important to address because this is actually something that was taking place. It was kind of a transition in Chicago that was taking place while I was like in junior high, high school. And I know everybody that's my age, you may remember this. You may have kind of flown under the radar for some people, depending on the area of the city where you lived in. I noticed like a dramatic change during that time period, man. So there's a lot of effects, though, that this has had, on Chicago indirectly. And this relates to a lot of other videos that I've had, and it comes into a lot of other discussions. Namely, so people always talk about why the murder rate was so much higher in the 90s, like in the 80s and 90s. And I had looked at some charts from year to year from like the 80s and 90s and looked at the race of the victims. And that was something that was kind of difficult to find. White on white murders back then, like in the 80s and 90s, were in the hundreds. If you look at the black on black murders and the brown on brown murders that were taking place back then, they really weren't higher that much than they are today. It was actually about the same, which is an interesting phenomenon when you consider like a lot of the discussions that have been taking place about like why certain things have caused an uptick or an alleviation of the violence in the streets. The white on white murders were really adding to that homicide rate, really creating those numbers that you saw back then. Today, the white on white murders are really like, you may have like 40 or something, 40, 50 like in a year. And a lot of them were like domestics and drug related stuff and stuff like that. Back then, in the hundreds, and a lot of it was gang related. Now, if you go back all the way to the beginning of the city, almost all of the gangbangers and gang members in the city at that time were white, and most of them were European immigrants. If you haven't seen my Chicago history videos, I talk about the origin of this here in Chicago. Now, for other cities, it may be different. I'm just talking about here. Blacks and Hispanics started to get into it. Well, blacks started to get into it like in the early part of the 20th century, and more gradually. Still at that time, I think the majority of the people in the streets were white. But I'd say probably by the 50s and 60s, it may have been about equal. I wasn't alive back then, and I have never seen any stats on that. But by the 80s and 90s, it was starting to shift. And by the mid 90s, this is really when it started to fall off as far as whites gangbanging. Now, the reasons why I've heard behind this, I've heard a lot of people in academia, try to break this down. I was somebody that was at that age and, in the city at that time where there was a white gang presence. So I'm going to give you kind of not so much an academic breakdown of this, but like a firsthand street level breakdown. At that time, you still had a lot of gangs. Okay, we're talking like 80s now, like early 80s. You still had a lot of gangs like the Insane Deuces, the 12th Street Players, the Simon City Royals, the Insane C-Notes, gangs like this that were like white gangs. Now, they were already accepting Latino members, and some of them were accepting black members too. Some gangs like the Almighty Saints, which I may make a separate video on because that's a continuation of that video I did on the Rebels. The Polish immigrants from the Rebels actually started a new gang called the Almighty Saints, which at first was a Polish gang, but later over time became a mostly Latino gang, although they still had some of the old school Polish members. One of them, I think, just recently died. His name was Joseph Krankowski. His street name was Butcher. You guys may have heard about that. He died, I think, I heard from health problems, but anyway, so, a lot of these white gangs were starting to, accept Latino members and stuff, but a lot of them were still predominantly white. And when I was a kid, guys, and I'm talking like grammar school age, there were like days I remember when me and my friends would be running home from school fast because we had gotten a word that gang members from the high school were going to come over there to try to beat us up and force us to join these gangs. There were police officers coming to our school, breaking down what each gang wore, how they cocked their hat to one side and all that stuff, so that we could avoid doing that, so that we would not be targeted. And this is a predominantly white school. It was majority Italians. Okay, I grew up in a majority Italian neighborhood on the on the northwest side. This neighborhood though was not poor. I mean, there were poor kids that lived there, and there were some rich kids too. But it was kind of a mix. The average family over there had dad, was in construction, teacher, fireman, stuff like that. I mean, it was like it was like middle class on average. You had some people that were poor, some people that were rich. Majority of the kids over there were like in the middle, had dads that worked like blue collar stuff, or this was going on like where even where we were at, the gang thing. In the 90s, though, that's when it really started to change, and a lot of the white dudes just stopped doing it. Now, like I said, there's a couple things that were going on. The first was that, okay, for white gangbangers, the street gang thing was like, it was like the NCAA or IHSA. Okay, the mafia, the organized crime was considered like the NBA. Everybody's goal, gangbanging or getting into the streets, if you were a kid, was eventually to make it to the level of organized crime. Okay? In the 90s, the mafia guys really started to get pressed, okay, by law enforcement. And a lot of guys started to go away. Everybody in the mafia started snitching. Everybody was backdooring each other, like turning on each other. And the whole thing, the organized crime thing was kind of falling apart. And it was kind of looked at as like their era was coming to an end. So in a way, it was like taking the NBA away, okay, abolishing the NBA. How many kids are still going to be practicing 4 or 5 hours a day, training, putting all their blood, sweat, and tears into this to try to just play NCAA for a few years? You know what I'm saying? Without those big leagues there at the end as the final ultimate goal, it took away the incentive for a lot of people. Okay, the other thing was that there was a big shift going on in the culture at this time. Okay, I told you guys before, I feel like, marketing coming from multiple angles, coming from corporate America, coming from the underground, from the streets, marketing has an enormous effect on behavior. And not all of this stuff is explicit marketing. A lot of it is just cultural trends that you see coming from these various angles, influencing the behavior of the youth. And at that time, the image of like gangsters and gangbanging in America was changing. Prior to that, the face of gangsterism in America was like an Italian or an Irish guy wearing a suit and a hat and stuff like that. In the 90s, with hip hop really starting to take off and gangster rap really starting to take off, movies coming out involving that left and right, the image started to change, and I mean on a mass scale. Hip hop prior to that was really considered like an underground art form, and you wouldn't really typically hear hip hop on the radio or anything like that. But in the 90s, that started to change. It started to go mainstream. It started to be marketed on a mass scale. The movies that were coming out, it was the same thing. And there was kind of like a peer pressure shift in the schools that was going on at that time, to where if you were white and you wanted to start, getting into the streets and gangbanging, it was like you were trying to be black. I remember this. It was before that, like in the 80s, like everybody was doing the gangbanging thing, and there were, people that were pressing me on that type of stuff. That continued to happen. I think the last time I got pressed, from somebody asking that if I was in a gang, was probably like 2001. It was just a shift in the consciousness among the white kids that like this isn't for us. And I remember this, like any white kid that started to do that, he was accused, like I said, by the other kids of trying to be black. And it wouldn't be something anymore that would help his reputation or make him more popular. It would hurt it. You know what I'm saying? Like prior to that, if you gangbanged, okay, now you're part of the in crowd, you're part of the cool crowd or whatever. And, it makes your status go up amongst the other kids. After that, after I would say like 94, 95, the white kids who were doing that were considered like, what are you doing? Like this isn't your thing. People who were in school at that time know what I'm talking about, man. It was definitely noticeable. And it was like mid 90s. It was like 93, 94, 95. This started to happen. You may hear a lot of people, especially in academia, attribute it to economics, saying that whites, started getting more money and moving out of the ghettos and stuff. First of all, the whites moving out of the ghettos happened like 30, 40 years before that. Back of the yards, south side, the west side, the whites that all used to live over there, that was happening like in the 60s. The whites still continue to gangbang after that, and there's always been broke whites. I mean, to this day, there's it's a sheer number. The majority of Americans that are living below the poverty line in America are white. The majority of people, as far as a sheer number of people that are on welfare, are white. Now, that's not as a percentage, okay, of the overall population. That's as a total number. But the point is, there's always been broke whites, and there's broke whites till this day. So there's always been whites that have an incentive to gangbang. Um, you go outside the cities and you see you can see endless miles of trailer parks out there where there's like whites that are living on paycheck to paycheck or not getting any paycheck. And you guys can let me know what you think though in the comment section. Anybody that was growing up here at that time, man. But that was really when it started to happen. Now in 2000. Okay, I remember this. There was an incident that I won't describe it in this video, but there was a bunch of like Latino guys that were pressing me, and just wouldn't. They did not believe that I didn't gangbang when I told them that I didn't gangbang and none of that stuff. They didn't believe me. I was wearing like regular fitting blue jeans. I was wearing like gold and blue basketball shoes, like Golden State Warriors colors, and then I was just wearing a plain white T-shirt. I had my head shaved. These guys, one of them had a shag. The other one, I think, he was actually half Mexican and Puerto Rican, and they just refused to believe that I didn't gangbang. I haven't seen that happen to a white person probably in the last 20 years. It's like they just don't. Matter of fact, it's the opposite now. Like if a white kid says that he does gangbang, nobody believes him. It's just there's been a huge shift. As far as like the videos that I've done about the few guys who are left doing that, you see the majority of them now are, members of gangs that are dominated by other races. EB Bands, Thug Life, Snowball from Tay City, Babyface from the 2-6, stuff like guys like this. The majority of them are like, they'll be like the only white member, in the gang or something like that. And they'll be usually from a situation where, okay, like Snowball was adopted by black people. Thug Life had stayed there in Pilsen. Babyface, was basically, he was the only white kid in the neighborhood or whatever. Like, it's situations like that. The majority, though, of the white kids today, and there's a lot in my neighborhood. My neighborhood is like, it's mixed like whites and Latinos, like my block and the area around me. We were just talking about this a few videos back about the Eagles. The Eagles is one of the gangs over here. But, yeah, you see like a few of them doing that here and there, but the vast majority, no more. And the racial conflicts that you would see back in the day due to the streets, like with the white gangs clicking up to go against the Hispanic gangs and the black gangs and stuff like that, you don't see that anymore. I haven't seen that. That wasn't even going on like when I was a kid. Like that era is long gone. So, yeah, a lot of those gangs that you saw like in the 70s and stuff, like 60s, 70s, a lot of that was like some racial stuff. It really started to fall off like in the 80s. But you guys let me know what you think down in the comment section, man, if what I'm saying is on point. But I mean, this is from firsthand experience. I really noticed like the big shift in the culture, like in the mid 90s. And two, like I said, the mafia basically getting taken down. And a lot of the other organized crime getting taken down, man. Let me know what you guys think. Those are your boy Chicago News. I'm out.